Hey guys, this is Tyler here. It is December, almost the end of December here in Estonia, and I'm going to discuss with everyone why guys that are looking at Asia, some things that they need to consider if they're looking at relocating to Asia, and perhaps some negative aspects of the Asian region for living long term. So it's been very common, especially in the past few years. Many guys have been looking at both Eastern Europe, at Balkans, at some of the Asian countries as possibilities to relocate to. We've seen obviously a lot of these things in the West just go out of control, and also in places like Australia. And most of the Anglosphere is experiencing a very challenging time right now, and especially for men. This isn't like anything new, of course. I mean, these were problems obviously that have been building for some time, and it's just coming to a head now with this whole crisis worldwide. And guys have to also realize that, like anything, there's always downsides anywhere that you go. And I have seen there's been this really obsessive level of interest in parts of Asia for relocation. Now, I'm going to give a disclaimer here. I've never traveled to Asia. I've never been to Southeast Asia. The farthest east I've been is Russia. So it's close, but it's still not Asia. And I have many family and friends and acquaintances that have traveled there. My parents, for example, they've spent quite a bit of time in Asia. They've been to many of the Asian countries. And I think for traveling to visit and stuff, fantastic place, honestly. Asia obviously is a huge region also. It's very expansive. And there's also a lot of diversity geographically, and people and customs and culture. There's a lot of differences from one place to the next. But I've noticed that just like maybe like Eastern European countries, there's a lot of diversity, and also in Asia, and also there's a lot of interest. Many guys are looking at Asia as a possibility to go to, whether it's like Philippines or Malaysia, or could even be Korea. There's all sorts of different perspectives here, and I think it works for certain guys, but I think for other guys it doesn't. And there are also guys that really need to look at the whole picture before moving to this region and ask themselves if they see themselves long term in that place. Let me first tell everyone something, and this is applicable with everyone here. I did a video about a few months ago, and I discussed like what it would cost living in different parts of the world. And many guys, many of you had said, oh, you could live in this place for this amount, like half the price I listed, or maybe a third less than I had listed. When I gave those rates, I was putting in perspective that you would be living there long term. Because this is the thing about it. You can live on a bare bone budget anywhere for X amount of time. I have an acquaintance here in Estonia. He's living on a budget that's probably half of what even like a lower class person here would be living on. He's living on a very low budget. Is it long-term sustainable? I don't think so. But this guy's in his 30s. For right now, he's fine. And he's kind of a bohemian type of guy. So it's fine for him. Now, just remember though, whether you're in hot or cold climates, over time, I mean, it is nice, obviously, to have some amenities and to have comforts if you want to be there long term, especially in cold climates. I live in northeastern Europe. Anyone that's lived in this part of the world, yeah, you can live on a low budget, but you're going to burn out very quickly. Are you going to last like 10 years, 20 years? Probably not, honestly. And you might have serious health problems because you don't have your social support networks like you do at home, so you're going to have to optimize your life, and that's going to take money so that you can maintain yourself long term in one of these countries. And I think it's also the same even in Asia and Southeast Asia. I mean, you can live on a really bare bone budget, but are you going to be able to do that for like 10, 20 plus years? Probably not. And it's probably not going to be very pleasant either. So when I gave those budgets, that was with a pretty comfortable lifestyle, because at the point in time we're at now, I've taken consideration that borders are going to be more restrictive. More guys, when they relocate, they're going to be relocating permanently. There's not going to be any going back. That's going to be the position of a lot of guys here. It's probably not going to be a very viable possibility going back. Obviously, we've seen in the past year the ranking of the U.S. has really dropped. The value of the passport, U.S. passport, has dropped a lot. And I actually have told people on my personal network, I think at the current moment, it's actually pretty, it's an uninflated number of the ranking currently. People think, oh, this is so off this ranking. I don't think so personally. Not when you look at the whole situation. Obviously, U.S. for better or worse, also demographically is not like a mostly European-based country anymore. I think with each passing year, U.S. looks more and more like a Latin American country, like Guatemala or Mexico or Brazil. And this is just where the U.S. is at. But in terms of when it comes to the Asian region, it's very important though to really look at the whole region and dial in, of course, on one or a couple countries as possibilities. But you also need to ask yourself, is it somewhere that you could handle long term? And is the trend of the country going to be as you forecast? Because unfortunately in Asia, many governments over there have their own systems of control. They may be a little different than control mechanisms in Western countries like US and Canada, but they do certainly have this mindset of control. And I sometimes think it's even more intense than what we see in the US and Canada. And also the difference I noticed is I think people tend to be more complacent with the control measures. In fact, many I think seem to like support it, whether you're in China, you're in Philippines or Thailand or Mongolia. Any of these countries, you see this very common mindset in Asia that these control mechanisms seem to almost be second nature for the people, unlike people from like the European-based societies. And you got to realize this, and also remember that look at the Asian countries, how much do they follow along with what the West is doing or says? Because some countries, because of trade agreements, political reasons, economics, business, they need to follow, they have to have their laws completely in accordance with the West. Because I know, for example, I work with someone, he lives in Singapore, and he informed me that like literally overnight people had to wear a mask within like the past few months. This used to not be in place, and then they just immediately changed it like overnight. And if you weren't wearing one, in fact, you could get like $300 fine. They have people on the street like monitoring to issue fines if you're not wearing it. And why did they change this? Well, it's likely that some high up government person probably spoke to someone in the US or maybe within NATO or one of these entities, and they were like, you guys have to enact this policy or something. And this is probably what happened. And they know that Singapore, they have a lot of benefit complying with whatever these Western countries tell them. Otherwise, it could really hurt their country and the economics. And obviously many wealthy people live in this country, and they can't afford to lose any of those people. And this is a common theme I see in much of Asia, especially in the Asian countries that kind of have systems where they're heavily dependent on policing like Western leaders, that you may think that you're escaping from something, like you're escaping the West, but you just may in fact be going into kind of another prison, we might say. And it's just a different prison, basically. Are these really strong leaders that are like, no, this is how we're structuring our country, this is the rules, we're not changing to please these governments, to please countries? Are the financial systems parallel to the like Western financial systems, or do they benefit? I brought this up before. If they do, that's a big warning flag. So going back though, take a leader like Putin in Russia. They don't have, he says no when no is needed. And this is a problem in a lot of these countries. That's not how leaders are. In a lot of Asia, whether it's Thailand or Japan or Philippines, often the leader does not say no. We're keeping our country the way it is. We're doing it this way. We're not listening to you. That's not often how these countries are, and so you have to just keep that in mind if you go and make the move there, which isn't necessarily bad. And I'm not saying it's going to be like that long term in these countries, but just consider that. And as I also mentioned, there is a mindset often of control in a different way in Asian countries. Many of the guys that I've known that have lived in Asian countries, as they've told me, there's good and bad. And I think it helps a lot, the guys that have like wives and have families there. I know some guys here may think otherwise, but the guys who are totally single, it's, I think, a little more difficult, because it's kind of like people that have to comply with things in the US or Canada that have families, that have, where there's kind of this expectation they have to follow the rules or else there could be issues. I think it's the same thing in Asia. For a single guy, where they don't have this kind of obligation, they may feel like this is kind of pointless to follow these procedures. That's why, obviously, I think the guys that have been married or are married, typically, in my experience, they tend to last a lot longer in Asian countries, whether you're looking at Philippines or China, Thailand, etc. Of course, this isn't always the case, but I think there's kind of more of an anchor there. And some guys, I understand, they don't want to be there long term, and they want to see themselves in that way. Remember too, as these countries develop, as the countries go from like either second or third world to first world countries, the whole mindset, the way that people operate, the respect for the government will just continue to go up. People will be less likely to have kind of a dissident perspective, and especially in Asian cultures. Like, this is across the board, whether it's East, Southeast, Northern Asian. These are groups, if you look at history over many centuries. I know Stefan Molyneux has discussed this, very well-known Canadian philosopher. These people, basically, they were whacked. They were taken out. If they didn't like abide by what the government, what the people in power told them, there was no like dissident voice. You couldn't be something else. You had to follow everything that you were told. Unlike in some of the European cultures, that was more acceptable. And this is obviously also why a lot of the innovation and much of the technology and science came from Europe, because if you look at over the course of centuries, European culture was one of the few where you could have more of a dissident voice and you wouldn't just be ousted. Yeah, I mean, of course there were exceptions. There were governments or groups of people in Europe that were not like this, but it was one of the few regions where you did find this. And so if you go look at Asia, this sense of distance really wasn't widely accepted in most of these countries. And so if you're the kind of person where you're more libertarian minded, you have more of your own way of seeing things, just because you're coming from a Western country and then going there, you may be dealing with a different set of problems. And also consider that the people on a whole that are from that society are probably not going to have this more distant mindset like you would have, or like maybe some people around you would have in your home country. Especially if you come from like a European country, it's actually more likely you'd find more distant voices there than you would over in Asia. And so yeah, if the country may be operating in a very good way, everything is functioning properly and you're pleased with everything. But if things change, if the government changes and they start enacting policies or whatnot, overnight, I mean, everything, of course, could change. And people would still likely follow what they were ordered, because, like I mentioned before, this idea of being distant and stuff is not really widely accepted. And then you have to deal with it in that society, and it's probably going to be more uncomfortable because it's not going to be your home country. Just keep that in mind. And you just got to look at how you fall. I think Asia as a whole has many great things going for it. Maybe it's having kind of this trifecta method that like Andrew Henderson discussed, or something where you have a home base there, but you don't need to live there permanently. you can have you can have a situation there, whatever it is. It really depends from person to person what works best, and that's what it comes down to. So give me your feedback below, and thank you.